Okay, so these days, you know, and over in North America, we might talk about, hi Rachel, come on in, handouts for you. And you're welcome to be on the floor if you want to be, that's fine. So today we talk about this thing called Zen like it's a thing, right? A distinct thing. There has never been a Zen school. There's nothing we can point to historically that says this here, you know, is the Zen school. There was nothing that came together that way. In Japan, there are 22 religious corporations registered with the government as being part of the Zen tradition. Right? 22. So that's Soto Zen plus 15 branches of Rinzai, plus the Obaku school and 5 other splinter groups that come out of that. So there's lots of Zens, lots of different kinds of Zen, right? Each of those 22 religious corporations has various temples affiliated with, so now you see how this thing has branches and lots of activity and lots of communities and organizations going on. So the largest Zen school by far in Japan is Soto Zen. It's got about 15,000 temples. The next largest one is one of the Rinzai branches, which has 3,300. So we've gone from 15,000 for Soto Zen to 3,300 for one of these Rinzai branches. So you can see Soto Zen you know, has the most kind of territory, right? And they go down from there. If you look at all those other branches, they get smaller from there. So what holds all this together as a Zen tradition is this lineage of Dharma transmission, starting with Shakyamuni in India, going through Bodhidharma in China, then to various ancestors in Japan, and then things start to break off. So all of the Rinzai lineages go through Nanpo Jomyo, who lived roughly the same time as Dogen. All the Soto lineages go through Dogen, who we know lived 1200 to 1253. He's the 51st generation from Shakyamuni. All the Obaku lineage is rooted in the Rinzai lineage and has then kind of a separate branch comes from there. Right? So think of it as a tree, an upside down tree. Right? Here's Buddha and Bodhidharma, and we get to Japan. We have Dogen, and things start to split off. So as for what happens to the lineage after Dogen, it stays one line from Dogen for 3 generations. Then we have something called the Sandai Soron, which I'm not going to go into, but there's a 3-generation split. Right? Things start to break off from there. So from Dogen, we go to Koun Eijo, we go Tetsu Gikai, we have Keizan Jokin. Now, Keizan Jokin is really important. From Keizan, there are 2 lines. There's Meiho Sotetsu, which is our line here at Sanshin, and there's Gasan Joseki. So if you're looking at the lineage handout, you can begin to trace a little bit of that. I've also posted the link on the Buddhist Essentials page on Sanshin Source. I've posted the link to our actual lineage here. So if you want to follow those things along, if that's interesting to you, you can certainly do that. So the Meiho Sotetsu line, which is our line, goes for 17 more generations before it splits into 2, and then into 4, and then into more. And now we have many, many, many different temples, different families, different lineages, right? So if you're looking at the handout that has the North American lineages, and yes, I know it's very, very small. I get that almost everything on the handouts this week is too small to read. Those things are pointers. Please go out to the Buddhist Essentials page and look at them on a screen where you can blow them up and actually read them. They're all there. They're linked or they're posted. You can go out there, like blow them up and really see. But if you're looking at the one that says Soto Zen Buddhist Association, I think on the top, and there's a circle right down that left side. If you right down that whole left side, you will get down to something that finally says Shohaku Okamura. And this particular one only shows Tywin Ellison and Shotai De La Rosa, but that's where I would be if I was on that list. This is not a new chart, right? So you can see exactly where we fall. The other thing that I think it's useful about that chart is that you have friends and relations, or you are one of those who's in another line. You can see where your cousins are, right? You can see where we're related, how far we have to go back before we have a common ancestor. It's kind of nice to just see all these teachers that you hear about in North America and how they're related and where they fit, right? It can be a little hard to know that. So I've certainly run into people who believe that every single practitioner in North America is a direct descendant of Shunryu Suzuki. In Los Angeles, in San Francisco, you can see from this chart it is absolutely not the case. Right? There are many, 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 many lineages. So, authentic transmission, which is what these charts are showing you, really important for Dogen. It's one of the main themes for Dogen. We can see that reflected in the way Soto Shu as a denomination is constituted and in the way it operates. So when we see that and we get that, well, okay, then it's important, wouldn't it be true, that clergy have standardized training so that they can carry on this authentic transmission from Shakyamuni through the 51st generation of Dogen down to here, right? So there is some emphasis put on some standardized training so that that transmission is legitimate and it carries Soto Zen forward, keeps Soto Zen alive. So if you look at the org chart, which is on the back of one of those handouts, that tiny little Soto Zen org chart, which you can hardly see, there is a whole piece in there about temples and training temples and education, right? So you can kind of see where training is important. So that kind of training for clergy happens at training temples or Senran Soto. They were originally modeled on the larger training temples in China. This is where Dogen went to train, right? So he was in the midst of that, and he had that personal experience of being in that container, and it was one of the two things that he thought was really, really important when he came back. And one was what he learned from Tendo Nyojo, his teacher, but the other was this monastic container. He said, this is how Soto Zen's going to survive. We need the container, we need the forms, we need the structures for this thing to live. So this training is a big part of what sort of keeps Soto Zen together as Soto Zen. How do we train each other, right? How do we talk together? How do we help each other and pass things down? So Dogen found that kind of training with the body, because temple training is training with the body. You go to Komazawa University to learn with this. When you go into a training temple, you're learning with the body. He thought that was really, really important. He wrote a lot of instructions and descriptions about that, right? How to practice, how to even carry out your daily functioning, how to brush your teeth, how to use the bathroom, how to take a bath, how to cook a meal, right? So we have the Eihei Shingi, we have the Fushiko Hanpo, we have Tenso Kyoken, right? We have these descriptions of how to actually carry out functioning in the training temple. So we can see, as we start to read Dogen, it can feel like he's got sort of two different voices, and one is very specific about this is how we carry things, and this is how we cook meals, and this is how we use the bathroom. And then there's this other part called the Shobo Genzo, which feels like it's way up here and completely abstract and not at all concrete. So we can, like, what's going on, right? So he's got these two sides of him, and he thinks that they're both important, right? It's the monastic container that's going to keep the rest of it sort of alive. So there are also important texts in this tradition concerning Dharma genealogies. So again, lineage transmission is really important here. Biographies of eminent monks, records of their talks. So how do we hand down something authentic and legitimate from generation to generation? So of course the Den Koroku, or the record of the transmission of the lamp is the way it's sometimes translated, is a really important text for us. Sotoshu just did a big new translation of the Den Koroku. So this is a record of the Zen ancestors from Shakyamuni through 28 generations in India, through 23 more generations in China. It finally gets to Dogen and to Ejo, and that's, that 52nd and 53rd is where that record stops. So those things create family style. They hold the family together, right? This is what's holding Soto Zen together. So of course, Dogen's life and the context around his life and work are critically important for understanding how this tradition, how this denomination, how this community develops. So we do have some Dogen biographies. There's a lot we don't know about him, but we do have some biographies which are relatively reliable. I also would point you toward our 6-part Intro Dogen series that I did a couple of years ago, which is posted at Dogen Institute. There's a link from the BE page. You can actually listen to those 6 talks about Dogen. It's not just his life, it's also the context. So it's also important to know something about Keizan. So I mentioned Keizan joking. He is considered the second founder of Soto Zen. So if you ask somebody, chances are, who started this whole Soto Zen thing, the answer you're likely to get here is Dogen. But actually Dogen and Keizan are considered the 2 founders. Sometimes it's said Dogen is the father and Keizan is the mother. And it has to do with their difference of style, their difference of approach, right? So Keizan, at least in North America, but I would say beyond that, is particularly remembered for things like including women in practice, including lay people in practice, offering things besides Zazen that just met people's everyday spiritual needs, right? So things like prayer, things like ritual, things like memorial services. He was a little bit more magic world in that way than Dogen was, right? So they were an interesting complement. They were several generations apart, but they were an interesting complement. You can see why you've got this kind of father and mother thing going on, right? Or you have 2 voices going on. So because Keizan was interested in reaching out, including people beyond the training temple, beyond ordained Sangha or clergy who are functioning in that way. Soto Zen starts to spread, it becomes very popular. So he is credited with popularizing something. Dogen's sort of looking inward and articulating things about the Dharma, and then Keizan is taking that and pushing it out and making it available to people. So Sotoshu centralizes both of these figures. We have Keizan and we have Dogen because they were each important and each doing something different. Now in a minute we'll talk about the political controversy about why we've got two, right? But two different approaches there, they were both important. So again, Dogen is exploring the internal self, Keizan is looking outward and spreading the teachings. So how do you reconcile having two different founders and two different approaches? Sotoshu will always position these two as being completely connected and consistent with each other, even though they were taking very different approaches and not exactly saying the same thing. Sotoshu will always say, but. Really, they're completely connected, completely consistent with each other. There's no discrepancy. So once Soto Zen was established, mainly it was spreading around in the rural areas because Soto Zen was a kind of more in the countryside as opposed to the urban centers. So Rinzai is popular among government officials, among the nobility, the literati. Rinzai strongly influences culture, particularly literary culture. So if you're looking around at medieval Zen literature, a lot of it is coming from the Rinzai side. Soto was avoiding connections with those sort of power centers. It was concentrating on the common people, on the folks who are out in the countryside growing food, right, living simple lives, trying to meet their simple needs. That one is not better than the other, but it's two very different directions. So it's useful to know that. So about 400 or 500 years after Dogen's time, then the government sets up something called the Jidan Seido system. This is the lay person and temple system, Jidan Seido. And again, there's information about that on the website. So this is a way to organize and control temples throughout the country. So now we've got a system, now we've got a structure for temples and lay people. But as time goes by, this also becomes a way to suppress Christianity. Now, the government's getting worried about this strange foreign thing coming in that's going to disrupt their society. So if you make everybody register with a Buddhist temple and provide support to that temple and make that temple then provide spiritual services, funerals, whatever to the laity, now we've got a relationship there and everyone can prove they're not Christians, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of administrative benefit to having everybody registered, and then it becomes a way to take the census and a way to collect the taxes and a lot of other things for the government, but there's this piece in there that says the reason we're making everybody register with the Buddhist temple is so then we know they're not Christian. So, what can you do? So every household has to be registered with a temple. Even today, if you have friends in Japan, they probably have all of their ancestors in one place, even if they don't live there anymore. All their memorial services, all their tablets, their graves, whatever, historically might be in one temple, even though the family has moved out of the countryside into the city to go to work or something, right? They probably know where their temple is. So that sort of mandatory system was abolished during the Meiji period, about the Meiji Restoration. Today it's a voluntary thing. So probably if that's where your ancestors are, you're not going to move them. It's kind of a big deal to move them. So voluntarily you probably maintain some affiliation, some relationship with the temple where your family is. That is still a major revenue source for most of the temples because they still have this parishioner support system. But the government is not going to tell you, you must register with the temple and you must support the temple and you must be Buddhist. So this is also about the time of three important individuals in the reform movement. You may know their names: Geshu Soko, Manzan Dohaku, and Menzan Zuiho. So if you're familiar at all with the reform movement, you know these names. These are important guys for that. This reform movement is a sort of return to the old ways kind of effort. So it's designed to push out the influences of other schools that have crept in. Are we okay? So, you know, there's some Obaku influence, there's some Shingon influence, there's some Shinto influence, right? So things are creeping in. There's a group of people that says we have to go back to Dogen. We have to push out all of these syncretic things that are happening. We have to figure out what Dogen was teaching. And that has to become the rule book, right? So, particularly this authentic face-to-face transmission becomes important because, again, this is the identity of the school. So if you've got all these other things kind of coming in and competing or adding or mixing, right, what do you want to go back to? You want to go back to the backbone. So that authentic transmission becomes even more important. This is about revitalizing the original realization of the Soto Zen school, right? So part of this is then having to research and edit and find texts. So now suddenly people are studying the Shobogenzo, right? Shobogenzo is not widely available. You can't go down to the bookstore and buy the Shobogenzo. Now suddenly it becomes really important to know what are our classic texts? What were they saying? How do we get access to those things? Now we start seeing Dogen study, right? People really getting down to what was he actually teaching, because that becomes the rule book. So in 1868, which is the actual Meiji Restoration, we have the overthrow of the existing government. The imperial family is restored to power. This is a long story, which I'm not going to tell you, right? But there's some significant shifts there. Now we have an emperor again. Well, the emperor is considered divine. The root or the seat of his authority is supported by Shinto theology. So emperor and Shinto have always been very closely tied. So Buddhism is going along doing okay, and now suddenly there's an emperor, and the emperor is Shinto. And guess what? Doesn't look good for the Buddhists, right? So Shinto becomes the center of society. The Buddhist elements are separated out. They are suppressed. Those folks are persecuted. This is where somebody mentioned the other day the story about one possible origin of the Raksu is that it's small enough to wear under something, so you can secretly be Buddhist in the midst of these persecutions, right? So this is not a happy time for Buddhists. Somehow, however, Buddhism survives in Japan, Zen survives, and of course today, Shinto and Buddhism and animism to a certain degree coexist. So these things have not wiped each other out. There is no sort of government decree that says you must be this or that, or you can't be this or that, right? So, very quick review of what exactly is holding Soto Zen together, right?